In woodworking, we're often faced with imperfect lumber, boards that are warped, or fresh lumber that's only been surfaced on two sides and not the edges. Sure, a joiner can take care of that. I mean, that's what a joiner does, right? You can clear up warps, you can clear up all kinds of things, and of course you can joint those edges. But what if you don't have one? You know, a lot of us don't have one. I don't have a joiner. But I know for a fact that a table saw can do the job and can do it well if you know what you're doing. The only problem is you can't use the saw's normal fence to joint those boards. You've got to have something special. That's why I came up with the solution, a custom jig that I'll show you how to make in this video. We're going to go step by step, and I'm going to guide you through how to get those boards straight and true, and it's actually going to be really easy. Okay, so here's the pieces, or the major pieces for my new sled. I've got a baseboard, which is 3 feet long by 12 inches wide. Now, I made it this size because this will allow me to straighten boards that are up to 3 feet long, okay? If I want to do longer boards, like say I'm doing a table and I need 6 feet, I would literally have to make my sled 6 feet long to make it work, so that I can make sure that I'm getting the high points on the side that is essentially going up against the fence, although there's not going to be a fence, okay? Now there's a problem here. Because this is longer than the depth of my table saw table. My table saw table is 25 inches and this is 36. I got an extra 11 inches there. So I've had to be a little bit creative on this, and the piece that's going to go in the track had to be modified to make sure that it would catch in the T-track. So here's my track insert. It is 3/4 of an inch wide and it's as deep as my T-track is. Now, my T-track on my saw is a little unusual. The standard depth for a T-track is 3/8 of an inch. Mine's more like 5/16. So I couldn't just go and get something standard. But to catch in the T part, the top of the T, I've inserted a piece of aluminum. This is 1/16 of an inch thick, and I've actually split the wood open so I can insert that, and it's epoxied in place. Now, my original intent was to take that piece, which looks like this, it's just a rectangle with corners cut off, and make a notch in my board and inset it in the notch. I could still have done that, but by putting it insetting it into the middle of the board, I've given it more stability. I've made sure that's less likely to come apart. Now, you might be wondering, well, why didn't I just use a washer? Well, because a washer would have a big hole of some sort in the middle, and a washer that have a small enough hole would be too small. A washer that would be big enough to go more than 3/4 of an inch wide would have a pretty good size hole in it, probably about, maybe 3/8 of an inch, maybe even if it only had a 1/4 inch hole. That's an awful big screw to try and put in here and keep it flush. One thing I've had to make sure of here is that my insert that's going to go into the miter slot isn't sticking up too high. I can't have any wobble here, because that wobble would convey into wobble of the platform, which means that when I cut the edge, I won't get it exactly perpendicular. So what I did is after I cut this to what I thought was the right size, I checked it in here, and then I ran it through a thickness sander to bring it down just a little bit more. And so now I've got a piece that's just the right height. And my insert is on this end, which is going to be the end farthest away from me. What that'll do is it'll hold it when I still have part of the sled sticking out this side. The way this is going to work is that I'm going to be using clamps to hold the piece that's to be cut to the base plate, okay? The edge of the base plate will be right up against the saw blade, and I'll get it that way by actually making it a little oversized and then trimming it to fit once the runner is mounted on the bottom side. Now for these clamps to work, I need something to hold up the opposite side, and that's what this piece is going to be for. Well, but I want to make this adjustable, so I'm going to put slots in here so I can adjust the position of these T-bolts. And then I also need to be able to move this back and forth on here, so I'm going to have to put slots here. So it looks like I got to do a little bit of cutting with the router. Okay, with the slots cut into the base panel here, the sled, I can go ahead and glue on my rail. Turns out my rail is just a little bit warped, but that's not going to be a problem because by the time I put the glue in the nails, it'll straighten right out. Don't want to overdo it here on the glue because I don't want a lot of squeeze out. Now, this was definitely one of those measure twice, well, not cut once because we're not cutting, we're attach once, because I needed to make sure I got it on the right side, and I got my metal guide piece on the front, and that's even with the fact that I flipped it over and I've got it upside down and backward. So I'm using really short brad nails here. They're only 5/8 of an inch, but they're enough to hold it together while the glue dries. Okay, so there's that part. So this will go through in this direction here with the clamp attached. And I'm going to put a handle on it too, more for safety reasons than anything else, so that my hand doesn't end up getting into the line of the blade. Now I've spaced this in such a way that when first time I put on the saw, I'm going to trim off about 1/8 of an inch off this edge. So this edge will be a zero clearance with the saw blade once I get it on the saw. I've decided to put a handle on here, both to make it easier to work with and for safety. The handle is going to ensure that my hand is off to the side of the blade because I'm putting it right over where the runner is, and it'll make it easier to handle it because there's really nothing good on here to hold on to while pushing it through. I really don't want to be pushing on the back side of it and end up with my hand, or the back side of the board that's being cut, and have my hand too close to the blade. So all I've done here is cut 2 little blocks of wood. They're 2.5 inches by 3.5 inches, rounded one end, bored a hole through it, and these will be essentially the brackets, I guess we could say, for the handle. I'm nailing them so they won't slide around, then I'm going to clamp them so the glue can dry. And the handle will go right through here. It's also going to be glued and nailed. It turns out that my 3/4 inch dowel rod is a little smaller than 3/4 of an inch, which is not that unusual to have happen. So it's really not going to want to stick together well on its own, but at the same time there's really no place for it to go, and there's not going to be a lot of stress on it. So as long as I get it in there and a single nail to keep it from sliding around, I don't think I'm going to have any trouble with it. I don't think my nail actually went into the dowel that time. That one did. Okay, a couple of clamps. This is a little tricky because I'm actually clamping to a rounded surface, but I'm trying to clamp to the apex of it. So I'm essentially on a flat surface, or at least a perpendicular surface, even if it isn't flat. Okay, we'll just let that dry, and then all I've got to do is put it together, and I'll show you how it works. Anyone that's watched me for any length of time has probably heard me say that I never do a project without making a mistake, and sure enough I did on this project as well. When I tried to mount this handle on here, my original thought was to put it right over the insert that's going to go into the track, the miter saw track. The problem with that is that it limits the position that my support bar here can be and my clamps can be, because if I go back too far, it runs into the bar. So I've moved the bar over near the edge away from the saw blade. Okay, it's still going to work fine, but I wasn't expecting that problem. Now, this piece is not actually a fence. What this piece is a support for my clamps, okay? So it needs to be able to move up and back and forth depending on the clamps, and I have a little bit of leeway for moving it back and forth as well. So I've gone ahead and put tracks in for moving it back and forth, and it has tracks on it for moving these. So let's go ahead and put these on first. So you notice the slots here are off center, and there's a reason for that, and that's so that I have more material. Well, come on. I have more material on this side where this pad has got to sit, okay? My original, if I had it right down the center, that might be, it might not work as well, let's just say that, okay? So, and these can move back and forth in these slots, so it gives me a lot of versatility for how I clamp my workpiece and the size of the workpiece. You know, this is predominantly for straightening out pieces of wood that don't have a straight edge, essentially using it as the table saw as a jointer, and but it also works as a tapering jig, so I want to be able to adjust this as necessary. So I've got those put together. Now I'm going to go ahead and put bolts up through here, holding this piece onto here, and again, this is adjustable back and forth. So there's that bolt. I thought I'd lost a bolt in here somewhere. Okay, so now I've got just one more thing I need to do to this before it's ready to use, and that's to trim this edge with the saw blade, so that will give me an exact distance from my track down here to the edge. So let's go to the table saw and do that, and then I'll show you how we use this tool. Okay, so now I'm over here at the table saw, and I need to trim up the edge, and then we're going to use it. So the first thing I got to do is get rid of the fence. There's a natural tendency to think that this sort of sled is used in conjunction with the fence, but it's not. It doesn't guide off the fence. It guides off the right miter slot, okay? Remember I had put that metal tab down here? So we're going to slip that metal tab into the slot. There we go. And here's what that metal tab's doing for me, okay? Not only is it lining up, but look, I've got all of this hanging out off the edge of the table, and it's not falling, okay? Even though the weight would make it normally fall. So I'm going to go ahead and trim this edge, and I'm just cutting off about a 1/16 of an inch. Let's try that again with the blade up. I bet it'll cut better now. Okay, I've got it cut, but it's got a little bit of a tendency to bind up on my riving knife. I can actually see the riving knife pushing over a little bit as it comes by. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and wax this edge. That should make it work a little bit better. I'm just using a block of beeswax here for this. I typically wax my various sleds and jigs that are going on the table saw anyway, just to make them run smoother. This is one place where I clearly need that. There we go. Okay, so that's doing better. Okay, so now that we've got everything set up, I can show you how we use this jig to joint a piece of wood. Now, I've got my piece here that, remember I told you it was curved in both directions. This is worthless. There's no way I can straighten this. Now, I wouldn't even try. I can't clamp it in here well enough to do that, to straighten it from either direction. By the time I got done taking the bad parts off, I probably wouldn't have anything left. So we'll set this one aside. I've got another piece here. It's about the same side, but it's only warped in one direction. I think that's pretty obvious that it's a warped piece of wood, okay? Now, normally I wouldn't bother straightening out this small a piece of wood. I would straighten up larger boards. I just don't have any larger ones that are warped right now, so I'm going to use what I've got to work with. Now my limit on this particular jig, or this sled, is 36 inches. I made it 36 inches long. That's the longest piece I can try and straighten out. And what I'm doing is setting it up using the edge of the board as my straight edge, the edge of the sled, I'm sorry. And I'm setting it up so that both ends of these are kind of lined up on that. And I'm going to go ahead and clamp it down with these two clamps. Now you got to be careful here. We don't want these clamps to get damaged. So I think I'm actually going to move this back just a little bit. This piece is not a fence. Don't even think of using it as a fence. It's not supposed to be a fence. Its purpose is just to give us support to my clamps, to the back side of my clamps, okay? So don't put it up close to the board. Put it far enough away that it will provide that support, and there's no risk of it getting caught in the blade. Okay, now that I've got that done, so what I'm going to be doing, it's bowed out this way. And I could go the other way too. I could do either side. Is I'm going to cut out the middle. I won't really be cutting hardly anything at the ends, but I will be cutting it through the middle to straighten up this edge, okay? So I need to bring my blade up. Put my hearing protection on. And here we go. Okay, first here's the piece we cut off, and we can tell from the knot hole it lined up right about here. So up at that end I wasn't cutting off anything. Back here at this end I really wasn't cutting off anything, but this piece tapers down to nothing, goes out to about 1/8 of an inch, and then tapers back down to nothing here. If we look here, we can see that this edge is lined up exactly with the edge of the jig. And so now when I take it out of the jig and put it on a straight edge, I've got a perfectly straight edge there. So now that I've got one straight edge, I could set this aside, lay this straight up edge up against my fence and straighten this edge. And then I'll have a board that instead of being bowed is absolutely straight and usable. The other way this jig can be used is as a standard tapering jig. It actually makes a pretty nice tapering jig. You want to make a tapered leg. A lot of mid-century modern furniture had tapered legs. You find stuff made that way as well today. So the other reason that I made it 36 inches long is because the tabletop is 30 inches or countertop's 36 inches. So this allows me to do legs for either one of those. And I've just got a board here that I've marked as if I was going to make a tapered leg. Okay, so I've got a 4-inch space here that's not tapering because that's where the skirt is going to be, and it tapers down by about 3/4 of an inch each side. So all I've got to do, since this edge is 0 clearance, all I've got to do is set it up. So I want my mark here where it's coming down to go right on that edge, and I want my mark here where it's coming down to go right on the edge. So you may have to go back and forth a couple times trying to get this just right, because when you adjust one, it affects the other. And then tighten your clamps down. Again, we're not using this piece as a fence. We're using it simply as a support for our clamps. Okay, so this is lined up in such a way that I should get a perfect taper there. We'll go ahead and crank the blade up. And it looks, just looking at it, like, oops, I made an error because there's a gap here. But remember, the top 4 inches isn't going to be tapered. That's where the table skirt is, okay? Here we go. Okay, so I take my piece out here. We can see that the piece I cut off is definitely tapered. It was on here about like this. And now this side is tapered, and I could do the exact same thing on the other side. Or we could do a square leg and taper all 4 sides. So here's our finished sled. It actually works really well, as you just saw. I both used it to straighten up this piece of wood, turning it into a piece of scrap into something that's usable. My end piece here is 3/4 of an inch by 1 1/4 inches. So it's a little bit smaller than a normal 1x2, which would typically be 1.5 inches wide. But it's still a very usable piece of lumber. And that's what I was after. Now, there are some pieces like this one we started out with that there's just no way it's going to be made usable, at least not safely. So maybe cutting some small pieces out of this. Now let me say something about smaller pieces. You might ask the question, why did you make a 3-foot sled instead of, say, a 6-foot sled? Well, if I was going to be trying to take pieces of wood and straighten them up to use to put a tabletop together, I would definitely make a 6-foot sled, or maybe even a 7-foot sled. But most of the stuff I work on, I use shorter pieces. And 3 feet is pretty much the limit of what most things will be. Not everything, but most things. So a 3-foot sled gives me a lot of versatility, okay? Because I can cut anything from a few inches up to 3 feet. And if you've got a board that's warped, you're better off rough cutting it to length, not finish cutting, rough cutting it to length, going ahead and straightening up the edges and then finish cutting than you are trying to cut the whole board off, trying to straighten the whole board, getting that bow out of it, and then cutting into length. You'll have less scrap, less square inches of scrap by rough cutting and cutting the small pieces and straightening them up first. Yeah, it's a little more work, but it's worth the effort in what you're going to save, especially when you're talking about some expensive hardwoods. So it really wasn't very hard to build this. Build your own. This would be a great addition to your table saw, along with your other sleds, your crosscut and your miter sleds. This will be a great addition, allowing you to take otherwise not so usable lumber and make it into very usable lumber that'll become part of many of your projects.